Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suhaniya. I'm one of the research registrars. And I'm presenting a paper that was recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Calorie Restriction with or without time-restricted eating and weight loss. What's happened? Okay. So just some background. So obesity is a major global public health challenge, and an epidemic of overweight and obesity is taking over in many countries. There's actually an article in The Guardian today that it's estimated that by 2040, 42 million people in the UK will be overweight. So in addition to the multiple medical issues associated with being obese, there's also quite significant social and psychological consequences. Weight loss through lifestyle modification remains a cornerstone of weight management. And even though modest weight loss of less than 5% does have benefits, it's very difficult for most patients to manage this long term. Daily calorie restriction is well established. So I just include a slide about circadian system. So the circadian system is controlled by a central clock, which is in the hypothalamus. And it's mainly influenced by light, but also influenced by other factors such as melanocortin, cortisol, and body temperature. It then sends signals to peripheral clocks, which are in various organs in the body, such as the liver, pancreas, heart, lungs, and skeletal muscle. And the peripheral clocks, although it's mainly controlled and regulated by a central clock, is also regulated by things like physical activity, meal composition, and sleep patterns. And this is important for many things, but especially to do with weight. So time-restricted eating is a form of intermittent fasting. It's popular because of its simplicity, and the aim is to align the feeding-fasting cycle with circadian rhythms. So this is to do with eating the maximum amount of food at a time when the body can actually utilize it, so that more of it is broken down rather than stored as fat. So in observational studies, eating later in the day was associated with weight gain. And there have been pilot studies that have shown that time-restricted eating resulted in reduction over time in body fat and body weight and fat mass, sorry. So I just included some current evidence from papers that have been published in the last 5 years. There are more papers, I just picked a few. So the TREAT randomized control trial published in 2020 found that TRE was not more effective in weight loss than eating throughout the day. Wilkinson et al. Also published a paper in 2020 with a single arm pilot study. And they looked at patients that had cardiometabolic conditions such as stroke, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and found there was improvement in cardiometabolic health in patients with metabolic syndrome who underwent time-restricted eating. Adafra et al. Published a systematic review in 2020 and found that a simple and well-tolerated diet that generated many beneficial health effects based on meal timing and dietary components. There were numerous animal studies. There's one in particular that looked at time-restricted eating and found that it protects mice fed a high-fat diet against obesity, hyperinsulinemia, hepatic steatosis, and inflammation. This is a randomized clinical trial. It was conducted in Guangzhou, China, over 12 months. The inclusion criteria was patients aged 18 to 75 with a BMI of 28 to 45. Exclusion criteria included diabetes, cardiovascular disease, GI surgery 12 months prior, active participation in a weight loss program, weight loss medications, and pregnancy.
They're just all comers with obesity and nothing else.
Yeah, so nothing else. They didn't have any cardiometabolic conditions.
Okay.
So the men were restricted to between 1,500 to 1,800 calories a day, and the women 1,200 to 1,500 kilocalories a day, which is approximately 75% of their normal intake. And the diet combination was between 45 to 55% carbohydrate, 15 to 20% protein, 20 to 30% fat. For the first 6 months, all the participants were given one protein shake a day to help with adherence. They also had dietary counseling for the duration of the trial, which is provided by trained health counselors. For the first 6 months, they had meetings twice a week, either through telephone calls or through app messaging. So they had a customized app which patients were using to upload pictures of their food, weight of their food, and time that they were eating the food to help with adherence. And then the second 6 months, they had a meeting with their health counselor once a week. And then they continued to record their intake. So the time restricted eating group were asked to consume the same number of calories, but consume it within a set time period between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m.
Oh, so both groups got the same diet, just different
Yes,
times.
the same diet, same number of calories, the calorie range, but it was just the difference was that the time restricted eating group had to consume the calories between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And they picked this time because the population they were studying tended to have their main meal, which was the largest meal, around midday. So that worked for their population. So the primary outcome was the difference between the two groups and the change from baseline in body weight at 12 months. Secondary outcomes were changes in waist circumference, body fat, body lean mass, and metabolic risk factors such as plasma, glucose, and insulin. They did area measurements of abdominal visceral fat and subcutaneous fat using CT scanning, liver fat with transient elastography, and quality of life questionnaires. So they anticipated a dropout rate of 20%. So they estimated a target of 69 patients per group to provide more than 90% statistical power and detect significant difference of 2.5 kilos in body weight, significant level 0.025. Data was analyzed according to the intention to treat principle, and a two-sided p-value of less than 0.05 was considered to indicate statistical significance for the primary outcome. So this is the flow diagram of patients. So they pre-screened 1,257 patients, randomized 139. So 69 to the TRE, which is time restricted eating group, and 70 to the DCR. And as you can see, they didn't have any dropout. Everyone finished the trial, which I was very surprised with. This is a table of the characteristics of the participants at baseline, fairly similar in both groups. There's no significant differences between the number of male participants, age, body weight, BMI, HbA1c, which is the glycated hemoglobin. Very similar. So the results are a primary outcome. So there was no significant difference in weight change between the groups. They looked at body weight at 6 months and 12 months. There's also no significant difference, things like BMI, waist circumference, body fat mass. They also found that the percentage of patients with weight loss more than 5%, 10%, and 15% at 12 months was similar between the groups. And this is part of the supplementary data. And as you can see, for the absolute change in body weight is fairly similar. There was slightly more reduction in body weight for the TRE group, but overall it seemed to equalize around 7 months. So graph C and D were the patients from the in-trial analysis of patients from 0 to 12-month follow-up. And graph D shows the percentage of patients with more than 5, more than 10, and more than 15% weight loss, which is similar in both groups. They carried out subgroup analysis to check if there were other factors which affected weight loss between the groups. They reported there was nothing there wasn't anything significant between the two groups, but I found that for baseline BMI between 30 and 35, there was a significant difference between the TRE group and the calorie restriction group.
Just explain that. I don't understand that.
-1.2.
1.2. It's still negative. It doesn't cross 1. Oh, I see. That's why it's significant. Because I see. Because the difference is definitely a number. I got it.
Yeah.
Well, what's the end for that? The number in that group?
So I don't. What do you? Okay. I
mean, if you take only those of that BMI, you might have a type 2 error in that you just happen to.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Sorry. It was in the supplement. This is from the so the majority of my figures are from the supplementary data.
Okay.
I'll have to have a look.
And so it's important, obviously, to take that into, if you test 20 parameters, you'll find one is significant, and that will be just by chance if you use 5. So, I think that's just the product of checking. There's a list there of like 25 different things, and one is always going to pop up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And did they make anything of it? Did they say, oh, this is interesting, or did they just?
No, so they actually I went through the table myself, because when I read it initially, it said there was no subgroup analysis to show there was similar weight loss between the groups. And then I went through the actual table and then spotted this, but they hadn't mentioned it in the supplementary data.
They will have had a statistician look over it, who will have removed it if they did try to suggest that. Yeah.
Because if you start suggesting, I mean, a lot of papers do make a lot of one little number, and then that's the main message, which is they've done well to hide it, actually, because it's a random thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's well hidden. These figures are again from the supplementary data. So this is looking at BMI and waist circumference, fairly similar between the groups. There is a slight the reduction within BMI and waist circumference is greater with TRE than DCR, but overall not significant. I did find interesting that in graph D, the diastolic blood pressure seemed to be higher. Well, the changes were greater with DCR than TRE, but I didn't know why that could be. Don't know if that's significant.
Is it? I mean, there's quite a nice bit overlap there.
Yeah.
And it's a change, right? So
the change, yeah, exactly. So these are the cardiovascular risk factors. So they had change from baseline, and then they have another column which is change from baseline. It said with dependent on the BMI. I couldn't find anywhere in the supplementary data about what they meant when they applied BMI to it. I didn't understand that. I don't know if anyone else. So it wasn't significant, the second column.
What do you mean?
Baseline.
Just explain that again.
So this table, so the first two columns are change from baseline comparing TRE and DCR for the cardiovascular risk factors, and there's no significant difference. And then they've done another analysis, change from baseline, and at the bottom it said change from baseline depending on BMI. Oh, yeah. I don't know how they'd applied the different BMIs to.
Does anyone know?
There was no significant difference, but I didn't understand what they'd done with the BMI. Okay. Sorry. So overall, they found that TRE did not produce greater weight loss than DCR. They had similar reductions with respect to reductions in body fat, visceral fat, blood pressure, and other cardiovascular risk factors. They felt that the calorie restriction itself explained most of the effects seen in TRE rather than the time-restricted eating, although it is an alternative option for weight management. It's difficult to compare with other trials because the regimens vary in different trials depending on the population study. So the time in which patients are technically allowed to eat depends on the population being studied. So it's difficult to compare them. The strengths and limitations, they had a good retention of participants. Everyone that was randomized was also seen at follow-up. They had long duration of follow-up, which is 12 months, and overall good adherence to the assigned regimen. In terms of limitations, they looked at patients with a set BMI who didn't have any cardiovascular disease or metabolic disease, so no patients with diabetes or any heart disease or stroke. They used a TRE regimen which fit their population. As I mentioned before, the main or biggest meal was in the middle of the day, and they didn't measure some things like energy expenditure.
That is remarkable. How did that get to New England? It's very interesting that they published a very good negative paper. I suppose it's very well powered.
But yeah, they didn't have any dropout. I'm amazed.
But also the power, in other words, the error bars. You see, because of course you can get no significant difference if you have wide error bars. So they must have the statistician right on it to.
But is time-restricted eating just about a way of facilitating eating less calories? And
well,
so
that's what this. Yes.
This shows that.
That's what this paper says.
Less calories, you'll lose weight.
Yeah.
And some people, time-restricted works because of their lifestyle or their food eating habits.
Yes.
As a way of doing that. Which is sustainable. So it's whatever works for you, isn't it?
Absolutely right.
Less, and some people will benefit because of, they eat more in the evening. So actually, if you restrict their food intake to 8 till 4 p.m., they'll reduce their calorie intake as a result of that.
Yes. Now, in that introduction, you mentioned clocks and peripheral clocks. And
circadian rhythm.
Yeah. Was that in the paper?
No, I just did a bit of reading around it. So I sort of, it's to do with these other papers. They talked in particular, I think it was the Adafra et al. Paper. They went into a bit more about intermittent fasting and why it's become more popular.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of when you have time restricted eating, it's a form of intermittent fasting, and basically it's about eating the most amount of food when you can actually utilize the energy from the food, rather than eating later in the day when you're eating and then you're basically sedentary and going to sleep.
Yes. So what this paper really shows is that doesn't matter, and all this hocus pocus science about circadian rhythms is not relevant. That's what.
Well, it could matter because their patients, so their patients tended to eat. So they said where the population they studied tended to eat the main meal, I guess in Asia, which is true, which is usually lunch.
Yeah.
And dinner tends to be something lighter like soup or something. Whereas in Europe, I think because most people work full time, your main meal is going to be your supper, which is later in the evening.
So the conclusion is we need to repeat the study in Europe with people who eat large dinners, suppers, and then restrict them like this.
Yeah, so restrict them to have a main meal that basically
they'll be a lot less happy.
The best study about sustainability.
So yes,
after the end of the study, if they go back in 3 years, how many of them are still at it?
Yes.
And I reckon it's probably easier to
reduce
calorie intake by time restriction than just by eating less food at each.
Yes. I think what this paper does is it just puts into context the fact that the science behind time restricted eating doesn't exist. Because people make it up. They go, clock genes and all stuff. And
it's a very good point, though, that actually if the control group were also having their main meals in the middle of the day, they're actually not comparing very much.
Yes.
Due to their cultural things. So during Ramadan, what people who are observing Ramadan, do they gain weight or lose weight? They must have been studied.
They do. They gain. See, the problem is Ramadan is an unusual time because what happens is there's a party in the evening. Everyone puts on weight because, I mean, the food, the quality of the food that people eat to break fast is very rich in calories. Right. If you're wealthy, but if you're poor, that's not the case. So that's a study that needs to be done in a randomized fashion. There's lots of people who say things, and if you look in rich households, they tend to use more unhealthy food, but that is rich households and not poor ones. And it's a completely different lifestyle, of course, for that month. I mean, some people are up all night praying.
No, I'm just wondering because they eat during a limited amount of time as well during Ramadan.
Yes, it's reverse circadian. They eat when they normally don't. It's very different, and they eat a lot more.
Because they eat a lot more, then that's a bit of a problem. Yeah,
it is a problem. And they eat sweet stuff.
I'm so sorry, I missed the take-home message of this one.
But it's a negative study. There's no difference between randomized people randomized to time restricted versus, as long as they restrict the calories, they can have it in this study in China between 8 and 4. There's no difference. I'm surprised that they published a negative study. I'm glad that they never normally publish negative studies. So that's quite useful to know that they sometimes do. The only other negative study I've seen that New Zealand published was Tablet, the one that looked at pregnancy and hypothyroid, and they found no difference. It's an important negative. So they must think this is an important negative, Suhaniya. They must think that.
Kareem, I think that the animal literature is very, very strong that this is true. So there's Nature Medicine times 10, 20, 30, 40. There's all literature on time restricted feeding. And even if you eat the same calories but at different time, glucose profiles, all that kind of stuff in animals. So there's a huge literature on this in animals, which is why I suspect it got into the New England Journal.
I see. So then the point that somebody made about it being done in a population that eat in the evening, it's got to happen. I think that was Alex said that. We need to do it again. But in a group who don't eat their main meal at lunch because they're the same as controls. Anyway, it's an interesting negative. I hadn't realized, there's lots then. The problem with animals is they're sometimes nocturnal and,
Sorry, well, the animal studies are promoting it or not? Sorry.
They're promoting it.
Okay.
There's a massive literature on this. And there's a guy in the States who's got his whole career on it with Nature Medicine and cell metabolism papers.
So the evidence I'm aware of in rodents, you can do time restricted feeding without and with animals that eat the same amount of calories, you will find greater metabolic effects, including higher weight loss, etc., in the animals that did the primary eating.
So this is what's going into all our diets. So the
However,
5, 2, or
the
8,
human
12.
literature is not as straightforward.
Okay, and this
So
is
in the larger, well-controlled studies,
okay.
you would not necessarily find any metabolic effects of time-restricted eating in humans over and above calorie restriction. Yes, there are a few small studies which we can all poke holes in, which say that without the weight loss, you can still get some metabolic effects, reduced insulin resistance, etc. Those are small studies with holes.
Do you think the main effect then of time-restricted eating is you end up eating less?
That's my personal opinion. But
Yes,
as
so
Roger says, people have had their whole careers on this. But that's my personal feeling.
There are a lot of people. It's very popular. It's out in the literature. It's all over the newspapers.
I know lots of people trying it.
Yes. So
Successfully.
so when someone says it worked because you got odd clock genes, this paper says that's not true. But there's a hole in this paper in that the time wasn't ideal. The population was wrong to study it. So
Kareem, I think for normal people who eat normally and are a bit obese like me, this would work because I'd eat less. Because
That's what Toby was saying.
That's exactly the right
That was
point.
the question I asked, and I think that's why it works.
Yeah.
that's the reality if you eat less. Now, whether there's an additional element on top of that, which is that clocks and all of that, which is again a very strong literature, I don't know. But I think most people would lose weight on this because we all eat all the time.
Yes, it's only animals though. Yeah, the clock gene data is only animals.
Yeah, true.
Because animals, there is the issue with animals being nocturnal or different life cycle, different light cycle.
Of course.
It's going to be very tricky to extrapolate that into humans. Okay, well, this is going to be an area that's going to run and run, isn't it? People are going to say, I'll just put the hole in this study saying it's the wrong population. Everyone's going to say that.
Maybe if I volunteer for a study, that would work.
That's what Wolsey said. Okay, so here we
go.
So we're going to have a huge lunch meal here, and then no supper. That's the plan.
It's never going to work for me.
That's not going to happen.
Thank you, Suhaniya. That was very, very thought-provoking, particularly New England publishing a negative study, but now I realise why.